Everyone thinks they know Florida, theme parks, Miami, the beach. But this state is enormous, and most tourists never make it past the same 5 exits on I-4. There's an entire version of Florida that doesn't show up on the brochures. Strange, beautiful, historic, and largely empty of crowds. Here are 15 underrated places to visit in Florida. Hidden gems you didn't know existed. Number 15, Apalachicola. There's a reason locals call this stretch of the Panhandle the Forgotten Coast. It's not a marketing failure, it's a feature. Apalachicola is a small city on the Gulf in Franklin County. Population just over 2,300 according to the 2020 census. And it moves at a speed that most of Florida abandoned decades ago. The downtown is lined with beautifully preserved 19th century buildings. Before the railroad arrived, Apalachicola was the 3rd busiest port on the Gulf of Mexico, ranking behind only New Orleans and Mobile. Cotton moved through here in enormous quantities in the 1830s and 1840s, loaded onto steamboats and shipped out to the world. An Apalachicola physician named Dr. John Gorey invented the cold air process of refrigeration in 1850 while trying to cool down fever patients. His work became the basis for modern air conditioning. There's a museum dedicated to him in town, the John Gorey Museum State Park, which is either charming or a sign that the city is running low on marketing ideas, depending on your perspective. The correct answer is charming. The food here is exceptional. Apalachicola Bay historically supplied 90% of Florida's oysters and more than 10% of the nation's total oyster production. The wild oyster fishery was closed in 2020 to allow the reefs to regenerate, and that closure was lifted in 2025. The return of the Apalachicola oyster, fat, briny, and legendary, gives the town's already excellent waterfront restaurants something real to celebrate again. The Florida Seafood Festival, held every November, draws visitors from across the state. The Apalachicola National Forest wraps around the region, giving you 600,000 acres of pine flatwoods and rivers to disappear into. And on any given weekday afternoon, you can walk the waterfront and encounter almost no one. That alone is worth the drive. Number 14, Wachee Springs. Florida has a lot of roadside attractions with a colorful past. Wachee Springs is the one that actually held up. The spring was scouted in 1946 by Newton Perry, a former U.S. Navy man who had trained Navy frogmen to swim underwater during World War II. Perry found a spring on US 19, surrounded at the time mostly by alligators and black bears, and decided it was the perfect place for an underwater theater. He invented a method of breathing underwater using a free-flowing air hose supplied by an air compressor, recruited women to swim in the spring, and on October 13, 1947, the same day that Kukla, Fran, and Ollie first aired on television, and one day before Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier, opened the first Wachee mermaid show. In 1959, ABC purchased the spring, built the current 400-seat theater embedded in the limestone 16 feet below the surface, and turned it into a national attraction. By the 1960s, girls were flying in from Tokyo to audition. Up to 500,000 people a year came to watch the mermaids perform. Elvis Presley visited. Don Knotts visited. Esther Williams visited. The Springs cave system descends over 400 feet and was confirmed in 2007 as the deepest known freshwater cave system in the United States. More than 117 million gallons of fresh 74-degree water flow up from subterranean caverns every single day. The Wachee River runs 12 miles from the spring to the Gulf, and you can kayak the whole thing through quiet, wildlife-filled corridors. Florida became the park's owner in 2008, and the mermaid shows still run. If you haven't seen a live underwater mermaid performance inside a natural spring, you don't have the full picture of what this state is capable of. Number 13, Cedar Key. An hour and a half southwest of Gainesville, Cedar Key sits at the end of a 2-lane road that doesn't go anywhere else. That inaccessibility is the whole point. Cedar Key is one of Florida's oldest towns and was once one of its most important. In the 1880s, it was a major manufacturing hub. Pencils were made here from the dense cedar forests that gave the town its name, and the Eagle Pencil Company operated one of its key facilities on the island. John Muir ended his 1,000-mile walk from Indiana to the Gulf Coast here in 1867, arriving sick with malaria, recovering for several months, and eventually departing by boat for Cuba. He wrote about Cedar Key in his journal with the kind of exhausted reverence you'd expect from someone who had walked across several states with essentially no money. The cedar forests were eventually stripped bare by the pencil industry, and Cedar Key's economic fortunes faded significantly. What remained was a small fishing town with a spectacular setting and a cluster of old wooden buildings that somehow survived when most of coastal Florida was getting paved over. Today, the town has a population of around 700, a few genuinely excellent seafood restaurants, a small but worthwhile historical museum, and the Cedar Keys National Wildlife Refuge, a cluster of offshore islands that are only accessible by boat and home to thousands of nesting birds. Kayaking out to those islands at sunrise is the kind of thing people remember for a long time. One regular visitor described it plainly. It's the old Florida that people talk about but rarely find anymore. Quiet, unhurried, and completely unbothered by the rest of the state. Number 12, Florida Caverns State Park. Florida doesn't have mountains, it barely has hills. The geography is flat, which is why it surprises people to learn that there are caves here. Actual dry caves with stalactites and stalagmites, lit tours, and chambers that look like they belong in a completely different state. Florida Caverns State Park sits near Mariana in the Panhandle, and it is genuinely one of the stranger things you can do in this state. The caves formed over millions of years as slightly acidic groundwater dissolved through the limestone bedrock. The result is a series of rooms filled with mineral formations, stalactites hanging from the ceiling, stalagmites rising from the floor, columns, flowstones, and delicate soda straw formations so thin they're nearly translucent. The park has been open for tours since 1942, guided by rangers who walk you through the chambers and explain the geology. The caves stay at a constant 65 degrees year-round, which is about 30 degrees cooler than the average Florida summer outside. In August, that alone makes the entrance fee worth it. Above ground, the park has the Chipola River running through it, which you can snorkel, canoe, or kayak. There are hiking trails, campsites, and a horse trail. But the caves are the reason to come, and they remain one of the most legitimately surprising things Florida has to offer. Number 11, Amelia Island and Fernandina Beach. Most people coming up the coast from Jacksonville keep their eyes on the highway and miss Amelia Island entirely. That's a mistake worth correcting. Amelia Island is a 13-mile barrier island off Florida's northeast coast, and Fernandina Beach at its north end is one of the best preserved historic downtowns in the state. The island has been under 8 different flags over its history, including those of France, Spain, Britain, the United States, the Patriots of Amelia Island, the Green Cross of Florida, Mexico, and the Confederacy, giving it a layered history unusual even by Florida standards. Fort Clinch State Park at the island's northern tip is a remarkably well-preserved mid-19th century fort that sits on 1,400 acres of beaches, trails, and marshes. The fort was occupied by both Union and Confederate forces during the Civil War. Today, park rangers and volunteers regularly conduct living history demonstrations in period uniform. The beaches on the Atlantic side of the island are wide, uncrowded, and backed by maritime forest instead of condo towers. Amelia Island is one of the world's most important loggerhead sea turtle nesting sites, with nesting season running from May through October. The Cumberland Island National Seashore is a short ferry ride away in Georgia, accessible from Fernandina Beach if you want to extend the trip. What Amelia Island offers that most Florida barrier islands don't is a sense of genuine place, a real town with real history that predates the tourist economy. Number 10. Bok Tower Gardens. This one tends to surprise people who come expecting a typical Florida garden and find something considerably more affecting than that. Bok Tower Gardens sits on the highest point of the Florida Peninsula, which, to be clear, is only about 298 feet above sea level, near Lake Wales in Polk County. The gardens were developed by Edward Bok, a Dutch-born Pulitzer Prize-winning editor and philanthropist, who commissioned landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. to design the grounds. They opened to the public in 1929. At the center of the gardens stands a 205-foot Art Deco and Gothic Revival Carillon Tower, officially known as the Singing Tower, built from pink and gray Georgia marble and Florida coquina stone. The tower houses a 60-bell carillon, and concerts are performed daily at 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock p.m. The sound of those bells rolling across the gardens and out over the surrounding flatwoods is genuinely unlike anything else in Florida. President Calvin Coolidge spoke at the dedication ceremony on February 1st, 1929. Edward Bok's ashes are interred at the base of the tower. The gardens are a National Historic Landmark and include Olmsted's original reflecting pool, ancient live oaks, and a pine forest walking trail that feels entirely removed from the heat and commerce of the surrounding region. For people who have spent a week doing theme parks and beach bars, walking through Bok Tower Gardens has been described as suddenly remembering that peace is an option. Number 9. Mount Dora. Mount Dora is a small inland city in Lake County, about an hour northwest of Orlando, that trades on the fact that it is the polar opposite of everything Orlando represents, which, considering how many people need a break from Orlando, turns out to be a very effective strategy. The town sits on a hill, an actual hill, which in Florida is considered remarkable, overlooking Lake Dora. The downtown is filled with Victorian-era architecture, antique shops, art galleries, independent restaurants, and the kind of streets that seem designed for wandering slowly with no particular plan. The pace is unhurried in a way that feels intentional rather than neglected. Mount Dora is known as the antiques capital of Florida, though that title doesn't quite capture how pleasant it is to spend a morning there, even if you have no interest in antiques. The lighthouse on the lake is one of only a few inland lighthouses in the country. Boating and kayaking on Lake Dora connects you to a chain of lakes linked by navigable waterways that runs across central Florida. The town hosts a number of well-attended annual events, an arts festival, a bicycle festival, a craft fair, that draw visitors but somehow haven't turned the downtown into a parade of chain restaurants. On a Wednesday morning in the off-season, Mount Dora feels like a small southern town that has figured out a very comfortable way to exist and would prefer you not tell too many people about it. Number 8. Micanopy. Micanopy, pronounced Micanopy, is named after a Seminole chief and is recognized as Florida's oldest inland town, established in 1821. It's located in Alachua County, just south of Gainesville, and if you blink driving through it, you will miss it entirely, which is part of why it has stayed the way it is. The entire town is essentially one main street lined with antique shops, a couple of restaurants, and a handful of preserved 19th century buildings shaded by ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss. The Herlong Mansion, a colonial revival home built in 1927, operates as a bed and breakfast and is one of the most photographed buildings in north-central Florida. The surrounding area includes Payne's Prairie Preserve State Park, a 21,000-acre basin where American bison and wild horses roam freely. Those aren't metaphorical horses. They are actual feral horses and bison on a Florida prairie, which is the kind of thing the state doesn't publicize enough. A raised boardwalk trail leads through the preserve to a viewing platform where you can scan the horizon for wildlife without disturbing anything. The film Doc Hollywood, released in 1991 and starring Michael J. Fox, was filmed largely in Micanopy, using the town's streets and buildings as its location. That connection to a movie about a big city doctor who gets stuck in a small town and eventually doesn't want to leave feels almost too on the nose. Number 7. Caladesi Island State Park. Caladesi Island is consistently rated one of the best beaches in the United States, and somehow most people still haven't heard of it. This is because the only way to get there is by boat, either the ferry from Honeymoon Island State Park or your own vessel. and that single barrier keeps the crowds away more effectively than anything else could. The island sits in Pinellas County, just offshore from Dunedin, on Florida's Gulf Coast. It's 3.5 miles long, undeveloped, and managed as a state park. The beach runs the length of the island's Gulf side, with sand that ranges from white to pale pink, and water so clear and calm it looks edited. Shelling is excellent. The island's interior is a tangle of mangroves and pine forest with a kayak trail that winds through the salt marshes. Dr. Beach, Stephen Leatherman, a coastal researcher at Florida International University who has been ranking beaches since 1991, named Caladesi Island the best beach in the United States in 2008. It has appeared at or near the top of his list multiple times. There are no concessions, no parking lots, no towers, no vendors. You take the ferry, you arrive, and you have essentially a pristine Gulf Coast barrier island beach to yourself, or close enough to it that the difference doesn't matter. The ferry ride is about 20 minutes from Honeymoon Island. The water on the Gulf side of the island is shallow for a good distance out, making it calm enough for children and unhurried enough for anyone who wants to float for an hour without thinking about anything. Dolphins are a common sight. In the evening, the sunsets over the Gulf from Caladesi's beach are the kind that make people stand at the waterline and go quiet. The park rents kayaks for the interior trail, which is the best way to see the mangrove tunnels and the birds that live inside them. Arrive on the first ferry, and you'll have most of the morning before the afternoon visitors start arriving. Number 6, the Devil's Millhopper, Gainesville. Gainesville is a college town that most people pass through rather than visit, and in doing so, they miss one of the genuinely unusual geological features in Florida. The Devil's Millhopper Geological State Park is built around a sinkhole, a bowl-shaped depression 120 feet deep and 500 feet wide that formed when underground limestone collapsed. What fills the sinkhole isn't rubble and water, but a lush, layered miniature rainforest fed by a dozen small streams that cascade down the walls. The temperature at the bottom is noticeably cooler than at the rim. Fossils and shells have been found in the sediment layers, representing species that lived in Florida when sea levels were dramatically higher than they are today. A 232-step wooden staircase descends to the floor of the sinkhole, giving you access to a world that feels genuinely different from the flat pine forests surrounding it. The site has been attracting visitors since the early 1880s. The entrance fee is $4 per vehicle. A few miles away, Payne's Prairie Preserve State Park, the same one that borders Micanopy, offers the bison and wild horses mentioned earlier, along with one of the better sunrise views in North Florida from the Bolin Bluff Trail. Gainesville also has the Florida Museum of Natural History, which houses one of the best butterfly exhibits in the country, a climate-controlled glass conservatory where hundreds of live tropical butterflies fly freely around visitors. The university town wrapping is easy to get past. The things inside it are worth finding. Number 5, Arcadia. Arcadia is a small city in DeSoto County in southwest Florida that sits about an hour east of Sarasota and is almost never mentioned in the same sentence as tourism. That's changing slowly. The historic downtown district is listed on the National Register of Historic Places and is anchored by the Arcadia Opera House, a 1906 building that has served at various points as a theater, a court, and a community hall. The surrounding blocks contain a collection of early 20th century commercial buildings in an unusually complete state of preservation. Arcadia calls itself the antique capital of South Florida, which puts it in competition with Mount Dora and about 30 other Florida towns, but the claim has some basis. The downtown antique shops are genuine and varied. The Peace River flows just outside of town and is one of the best fossil hunting rivers in Florida. Prehistoric shark teeth, mammoth teeth, horse teeth, and giant ground sloth bones turn up regularly in the riverbed for anyone willing to wade in with a scoop screen and some patience. Peace River Canoe Outpost offers multi-day canoe camping trips down the river, which ranks among the more authentic outdoor experiences available in this part of the state. The Arcadia All-Florida Championship Rodeo, held in March and July every year, is one of the oldest and most respected rodeos in the southeastern United States and has been running since 1928. If you've never seen a real rodeo and aren't sure whether the sport is your thing, this is a good place to find out. Arcadia is a working cattle town, and that identity, distinct from the beach resort and theme park versions of Florida that dominate the state's tourism economy, is something it wears straightforwardly. The ranches around DeSoto County cover thousands of acres. The Peace River corridor running through the area draws kayakers who want to spend a night or two camping on sandy banks far from any road, counting the stars and pulling fossil teeth from the riverbed in the morning. Arcadia doesn't hustle you, it just lets you be there. Number 4, Wakulla Springs State Park. About 15 miles south of Tallahassee, Wakulla Springs State Park contains one of the largest and deepest freshwater springs in the world, and one of the most historically significant in Florida. The main spring produces a staggering 400,000 gallons of water per minute. The water is so clear that you can see the bottom, 100 feet down, on a calm day from the surface. Mastodon bones have been recovered from the spring basin, and the remains are thought to be at least 10,000 years old. The spring was used as a filming location for the original creature from the Black Lagoon in 1954, and for the third film in the series, The Creature Walks Among Us, in 1956. The second sequel used Silver Springs instead, which is either a selling point or a deterrent, depending on how you feel about 1950s monster movies. The lodge at Wakulla Springs is a beautifully preserved Florida lodge built in 1937 under the ownership of financier Edward Ball, with marble floors, original wrought iron light fixtures, and a dining room that serves the kind of food that makes sense in a building that old. The glass-bottom boat tours on the spring run through a river corridor thick with alligators, manatees, limpkins, herons, and anhinga. The wildlife density is extraordinary, closer to what you'd find in the Everglades than what you'd expect an hour from a state capital. Number 3, Tarpon Springs. Tarpon Springs is about 35 miles northwest of Tampa, and it has a story unlike anywhere else in Florida. In the late 1800s, John Kokoris, a Greek-American businessman, recognized that the waters around Tarpon Springs were ideal for natural sponge harvesting. He brought in Greek divers from the Caladesi Islands beginning around 1905, and within a few years, Tarpon Springs had the largest Greek-American community in the United States. The Greek Orthodox faith, cuisine, language, and traditions took root deeply enough that they're still very much present today, more than a century later. The sponge docks along Dodecanese Boulevard remain operational, with sponge boats still heading out to harvest natural sea sponges from the Gulf floor. The Spongerama Museum tells the history of the industry in admittedly more detail than most visitors require, but the broader neighborhood is excellent. Greek restaurants, bakeries, a genuine Greek Orthodox cathedral, and an annual Epiphany celebration that draws thousands of people to watch young men dive into Spring Bayou to retrieve a cross. The event has been happening every January 6th since 1907, and is the largest Epiphany celebration in the Western Hemisphere. Beyond the docks and the religious traditions, Tarpon Springs has genuinely excellent food. The bakeries along the main drag sell lukumades, Greek honey fritters, and spanakopita and baklava in quantities that suggest the locals are not planning to run out anytime soon. Mykonos Restaurant and Hellas Restaurant and Bakery are both long-standing institutions. The town sits on Spring Bayou and several smaller bayous that feed into the Gulf, and boat tours of the waterways give you a view of the old fishing community that no amount of walking the tourist strip can fully replace. Number 2, Lake Placid. Lake Placid, Florida, and Lake Placid, New York share a name and almost nothing else. One hosted the 1980 Winter Olympics. The other is a small town in Highlands County in south-central Florida, about 2 hours south of Orlando, surrounded by lakes and known almost exclusively for caladiums, a tropical plant with enormous, brightly colored leaves that is grown on commercial farms covering thousands of acres around the town. Lake Placid calls itself the Caladium capital of the world, and that claim is essentially uncontested because essentially no one else is competing for it. The farms surrounding the township, something in the neighborhood of 98% of all caladiums sold in the United States, a fact that is more impressive the more you think about it. The annual Caladium Festival each summer draws visitors who might otherwise have no particular reason to come to a small farming town in Highlands County. What the town also has is the Archbold Biological Station, a private research facility that has been conducting field research on the Lake Wales Ridge ecosystem since 1941. The scrub habitat on the ridge is one of the most biologically unique in North America, home to species found nowhere else on Earth, and Archbold's research on it has been foundational to conservation biology. Public programs and guided walks are available for visitors. The lakes around town are clean, quiet, and largely uncrowded. Lake June in winter and several neighboring lakes are navigable by kayak or pontoon, with fishing, tubing, and the kind of slow-moving water recreation that no longer requires booking 6 weeks in advance. Number 1. Yankeetown. The town of Yankeetown sits on the Gulf Coast in Levy County, in the part of Florida that tourists genuinely don't reach, north central, past where most maps of things to do in Florida bother to go. The population hovers around 600. There is no strip mall, there is no franchise hotel. There is a boat ramp and a river and a lot of fish. The town sits at the mouth of the Withlacoochee River, where it meets the Gulf of Mexico. The Bird Creek Beach offers a quiet stretch of natural shoreline, almost entirely free of crowds. The Withlacoochee Gulf Preserve covers 413 acres of coastal wetlands, salt marshes, and forested islands accessible by kayak and canoe. The bird life in this part of the coast is extraordinary. Ospreys, roseate spoonbills, wood storks, and herons are routine sightings. The town got its name in the 1920s from Adheron Jones, a Chicagoan who purchased land and developed it, and whose northern workers were referred to by locals as Yankees. The name stuck, officially and affectionately. Yankeetown is, in the most straightforward sense, a place where nothing much happens, which is precisely the point. The Gulf Coast here is undeveloped, the waters are clean, and the town has no particular desire to be anything other than what it is. If your idea of Florida is loud, crowded, and expensive, Yankeetown will recalibrate that considerably. Florida is a lot bigger and stranger and more varied than the version most people visit. The springs, the small towns, the caves, the islands you can only reach by boat, they're all still here, still accessible, still largely ignored by the crowd stacking up at the theme park exits. The state rewards anyone willing to drive a little farther down the 2-lane road and see what's waiting at the end. If this video helped you find your next trip, hit the like button and subscribe. We cover hidden histories, overlooked places, and the stories most travel guides don't bother to tell.